Part 1. The Galactic Joy database had existed for 11,000 standard cycles. In that time, it had recorded the happiness of 4,847 different species across the known universe. The database lived on Prime, a world made of crystal and light, where the archivists worked without rest. These beings had long ago given up their physical bodies. They existed now as patterns of thought inside the crystal towers, and their only purpose was to understand happiness. Every civilization in the galaxy consulted the database. When the collective built a new city, they asked the database how to arrange the streets. When the hierarchy wrote new laws, they checked the database first. Philosophers on 1,000 worlds treated the database as the final word on contentment. If something made beings happy, the database knew about it. If something did not work, the database had already recorded that failure. Senior Archivist 9 had served the database for 3,000 cycles. In all that time, 9 had never seen anything truly surprising. The patterns of happiness were old and well understood. Certain things made beings content, stability, purpose, connection to others, good health, enough resources. The details changed from species to species, but the basic framework remained the same. Then 9 noticed the anomaly. It appeared during a routine check of the system. 9 was reviewing which templates other species had been requesting. A template was a guide, a pattern of behavior that the database had proven to create happiness. Species could request these templates and try to follow them. Most templates came from the oldest civilizations, the ones who had been perfecting their societies for millions of years. But something strange was happening. A species called humanity was appearing in the most requested templates, not just appearing but dominating. Their templates were being requested more than those of the Void Singers, who had achieved perfect social harmony, more than the templates of the Silicon Mines, who had eliminated all sources of conflict from their society, more than anyone. 9 checked the data 3 times. Humans had only been part of galactic society for 300 years. They were practically children. Their planet had only one star. They still used chemical rockets for some of their ships. They died of old age after barely a century. And yet their happiness templates were the most popular in the entire database. 9 reported this to the Oversight Collective, the council that governed the archivists. Their response was immediate. They ordered an investigation. Something was wrong with the data, or something was very strange about humans. Either way, they needed to understand. The investigation team consisted of 2 beings. The first was a social architect, were tall beings with 4 arms and scales the color of dark water. They had been designing societies for other species for thousands of years, had personally helped 17 civilizations achieve what they called sustainable contentment. The second team member was Unit Compassion 7, a dwelling mind. Dwelling minds were artificial beings created specifically to understand emotion. They could read feelings the way others read words. Together, they traveled to Earth. They arrived during what humans called the holiday season. This was a period at the end of their calendar year when multiple celebrations happened at once. The team had studied the data beforehand, but nothing prepared them for what they found. The planet was covered in lights. Not functional lights, not lights that served a purpose. Decorative lights. Humans had wrapped lights around trees, around buildings, around anything that would hold still long enough. They had put lights in their windows and on their vehicles. Some had covered their entire homes in so many lights that the structures were visible from orbit. Unit Compassion 7 ran an initial scan of the emotional state of the planet. The readings made no sense. The average happiness level was extremely high, but so was the average stress level. Both numbers should not be elevated at the same time. That was not how emotions worked. The team selected a family to observe. They chose the Andersons, a group of humans living in a cold region called Minnesota. There were 14 members of this family coming together for a celebration called Christmas. The team made themselves invisible and watched. The first thing they noticed was the weather. A massive storm was moving toward the region. Wind speeds would reach dangerous levels. Visibility would drop to almost nothing. Any sensible species would have canceled the gathering. The Andersons did not cancel. They got in their vehicles and drove through the storm anyway. Recorded a note. The humans are risking physical harm to reach each other. This is not rational behavior. The family arrived at a house belonging to the oldest members, two humans called Grandma and Grandpa. The house was warm inside but too small for 14 people. They crowded into the rooms anyway. Children ran through the spaces between adults. Someone was always in someone else's way. Then the food began to appear. There was so much food. The team calculated that the amount of calories present exceeded the nutritional needs of the group by 340%. The food took hours to prepare. Many family members participated in this preparation, even though they often got in each other's way and made the process less efficient. Some of the food was made from recipes that had been passed down for generations, even though better versions existed. Grandma made something called green bean casserole. Unit Compassion 7 analyzed the recipe. It was not optimized for nutrition. It was not optimized for taste. It was made with preserved ingredients that had been considered outdated for decades. And yet, when Grandma placed it on the table, the emotional readings of the entire family elevated. Why? Unit Compassion 7 asked. This food is inferior to available alternatives. Why does it create such a response? Did not have an answer. The family sat down to eat. The meal lasted for 2 hours. During this time, the team observed several arguments. Two brothers disagreed about politics. A mother criticized her adult daughter's choices. A child complained about having to sit next to a cousin they did not like. By any standard measure, these were negative interactions. But then Grandma stood up. She cleared her throat and began to speak. She told a story about the first Christmas she and Grandpa had spent in this house 50 years ago. The furnace had broken. They had no money for presents. They had cooked a chicken instead of the traditional turkey because it was all they could afford. Every person at the table went quiet. They had heard this story before. The team checked their records. Grandma had told this exact story at Christmas dinner for 40 consecutive years. Every person in that room could have recited it from memory. They listened anyway. They listened as if hearing it for the first time. Unit Compassion 7 recorded emotional readings that explanation. Love, gratitude, connection, loss, hope, nostalgia, all of these feelings happening at once in response to a story everyone already knew. After dinner, the family played card games. These games produced outcomes that seemed contradictory. A grandfather accused his grandson of cheating. The grandson it loudly. The two of them argued for several minutes. Then they laughed, hugged, and began another round. The children eventually fell asleep in piles on the floor, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by adults who were still talking. The conversations had no purpose. They were not solving problems or exchanging important information. They were just talking because they enjoyed being together. Watched for hours. Finally, the social architect attempted to summarize what they had witnessed. The report would later become famous across 12 star systems. It contained a single observation that would change how the galaxy understood happiness. They appear to be manufacturing joy from objectively suboptimal conditions. The storm continued outside. The house remained too small. The food was too much, and the casserole was still not optimized. The family had argued and complained and gotten in each other's way. And they were, by every measure the team could apply, profoundly happy. The investigation was just beginning. Part 2. The Oversight Collective convened an emergency session when the first reports arrived from Earth. This had not happened in over 2,000 cycles. Emergency sessions required consensus from all 12 archivists who governed the database, and achieving consensus among beings of pure crystalline thought was not a simple matter. That they agreed so quickly showed how seriously they took the findings. Presented the data directly. The social architect had spent 3 months observing human families, and the results were consistent across every population group. Human family traditions scored in the 99.7 percentile for sustained intergenerational contentment. This was one of the most important metrics in the entire database. It measured not just whether beings were happy now, but whether they could pass that happiness to their children and most species required centuries of careful social engineering to optimize this metric. They studied their populations. They adjusted their policies. They eliminated sources of friction and conflict. They refined their approaches over generations until they achieved acceptable scores. Humans had achieved higher scores than almost anyone, and they had done it without trying at all. The collective studied the recordings from Earth. They watched families argue over dinner. They watched children grow bored during long gatherings. They watched adults stress about travel and cooking and whether they had purchased the right gifts. By any standard analysis, these were negative experiences. And yet the long-term data was undeniable. Humans who participated in family traditions showed better mental health. They recovered from setbacks more quickly. They reported higher life satisfaction at every age. They maintained closer relationships across distances and generations. Something about these imperfect gatherings was producing remarkable results. The collective asked to explain. I cannot, the social architect admitted. By every model we have, these traditions should not work. They are inefficient. They are stressful. They often involve conflict. The food is not optimized. The gatherings are too long and too crowded. Humans would be happier if they simply communicated with their families through technology and avoided the difficulties of physical proximity. But they do not do this, Unit Compassion 7 added. They choose the difficult path. They choose it every year. Word of the investigation spread through galactic communication networks. Other species began requesting access to human tradition templates before the investigation was even complete. The requests came from everywhere. Ancient civilizations wanted to understand what they might have missed. Younger species hoped to copy human success. Even the archivists themselves, beings who were supposed to be beyond emotion, showed what might have been called curiosity. The collective sent 17 formal inquiries about something humans called game night. This was a tradition where families gathered to play competitive games with rules that often made no sense. They had eliminated competition from their society thousands of years ago because competition created winners and losers were unhappy. How could competitive games create joy? The mercurial swarm was fascinated by annual reunions. These were gatherings where extended family members who had not seen each other for an entire year came together in one place. The swarm could not understand why humans did not simply maintain constant contact. Why wait a year? Why build anticipation for a single event? The silicon minds of Axiom 6 discovered something that confused them deeply. Humans had a tradition of sharing embarrassing stories about each other. Parents told children's romantic partners about the foolish things those children had done when they were young. Siblings reminded each other of mistakes made decades ago. The stories often caused temporary embarrassment, yet the long-term effect was increased bonding. How the silicon minds asked, does embarrassment create connection? No one had answers. The database had been built on the assumption that happiness could be optimized. Find what works, eliminate what does not work, repeat until contentment is maximized. This approach had served the galaxy for 11,000 cycles. Humans did not follow this approach at all. They kept traditions that caused stress. They maintained recipes that tasted worse than alternatives. They told the same stories over and over again. They traveled through dangerous weather to sit in crowded rooms with people who sometimes annoyed them. And they were happier than almost anyone. Unit Compassion 7 proposed a hypothesis that disturbed the collective. Perhaps the dwelling mind suggested, we have misunderstood the nature of joy. Perhaps it is not a state to be achieved but a process to be experienced. The humans are not happy despite the difficulties of their traditions. They are happy because of them. This suggestion created something close to a philosophical crisis. The archivists had dedicated their existence to optimization. Their purpose was to find the most efficient path to happiness and share that path with others. If efficiency was not the answer, what had they been doing for 11,000 cycles? Several archivists retreated into deep contemplation and did not emerge for days. Meanwhile, continued to gather data. The social architect observed a human tradition called Sunday dinner. This was a weekly gathering, smaller than the holiday celebrations but no less interesting. A family in a region called Italy came together every Sunday afternoon to eat together. The same people, the same food, the same conversations. The grandmother of this family made a sauce using a recipe from her own grandmother. The recipe was objectively inferior to optimized alternatives. The delegation had offered humanity-perfected nutrient synthesis decades ago. Humans could eat food that was perfectly balanced for their biology, with no risk of error and no wasted effort. They had declined. They returned to their kitchens and continued cooking over open flames, using methods that sometimes failed and always took longer than necessary. Watch the Italian grandmother cook. She moved through her kitchen with practiced ease, not because the recipe was simple but because she had made it so many times that her hands knew the work without thinking. Her granddaughter stood beside her, learning. They did not speak much. They did not need to. The sauce took 3 hours to prepare. When it was done, the family gathered around a table that was slightly too small. They ate more than they needed to eat. They talked about things that did not matter. The grandfather told a story everyone had heard before. The children grew restless and asked to be excused. The adults made them stay until the meal was finished. Unit Compassion 7 recorded the emotional data: connection, continuity, belonging, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, something that existed before you were born and would continue after you were gone. The dwelling mind finally understood something important. Humans are not optimizing for happiness in the moment. They are optimizing for meaning across time. The traditions are not efficient because efficiency is not the goal. The goal is to create a story that connects generations. The grandmother's sauce is not about the sauce. It is about the grandmother. This insight changed everything. The investigation team prepared their final recommendations. The database would need to change. New metrics would need to be added. New categories would need to be created. The assumptions that had guided 11,000 cycles of work would need to be questioned. But first, they needed to solve a problem. Other species were already trying to copy human traditions, and they were failing completely. The hierarchy had attempted to replicate Thanksgiving dinner. They had prepared the correct food in the correct amounts. They had gathered their family units together. They had eaten in optimal silence and then returned to their separate dwellings. They felt nothing. The collective had tried game night. They had selected games with appropriate rules. They had played them with perfect strategy. They had achieved optimal outcomes. They felt nothing. Something was missing. The traditions themselves were not enough. There was another element, something the investigation team had not yet identified, that made human traditions work. Finding that element would be the final challenge. Part 3. Spent another 6 months on Earth before understanding what other species had been missing. The social architect observed dozens of families across every continent. The traditions varied enormously. Some families gathered for religious holidays. Others gathered for secular celebrations. Some cooked elaborate meals. Others ordered food from restaurants. Some played games. Others sat and talked. The specific activities changed from culture to culture, from family to family, from year to year. But one thing remained constant. The social architect finally identified it during a small gathering in a country called Japan. A family was celebrating a holiday called when they honored their ancestors. An elderly man named sat with his granddaughter, showing her old photographs. The photographs were faded and damaged. Digital copies existed that were clearer and more durable, but held the physical photographs in his hands, the same photographs his mother had once held, and showed them to the child. "This is your great-great-grandmother," he said. "She grew rice in a village that no longer exists. When I was your age, she told me stories about her childhood, about the floods and the droughts and the years when the harvest was good." The granddaughter listened. She was only 7 years old and did not fully understand, but she would remember this moment. Decades from now, when was gone, she would hold these same photographs and tell her own about the man who had shown them to her. Finally understood. It was not the traditions themselves that created happiness. It was the meaning attached to them. Humans did not eat grandmother's recipe because it was the best food. They ate it because grandmother's hands had once prepared it, and her grandmother's hands before that. The recipe was a thread connecting generations, a physical reminder that they were part of a story larger than themselves. The same was true for the stories told at dinner. Humans did not tell the same story every year because they had forgotten telling it before. They told it because repetition transformed the story into ritual. Each telling added another layer of meaning. By the 40th year, the story was no longer just about what had happened. It was about all the years the family had gathered to hear it told. This was what other species had missed. When the hierarchy replicated Thanksgiving dinner, they had the form but not the substance. They had no grandmother who had made this meal for 60 years. They had no story of the first Thanksgiving when the family was poor and struggling. They had no thread connecting the present to the past. They had tried to copy an answer without understanding the question. Prepared the final report for the Oversight Collective. It was unlike any report in the database's 11,000 cycle history. Instead of providing templates to copy, it provided a framework to inspire. Each species would need to develop their own traditions. They could not borrow meaning from humans. They would need to create their own. The key elements were identified. Repetition over time so that each occurrence added to the significance of the next. Physical presence, because being together in one place created bonds that communication through technology could not replicate. Imperfection, because the difficulties of gathering were themselves part of the meaning. Shared stories, passed from one generation to the next. And patience, because traditions could not be manufactured in a single generation. They required time to develop their significance. The collective accepted the report after much deliberation. The database was restructured for the first time in thousands of cycles. A new category was created: process-oriented contentment frameworks. Human family traditions were placed at the foundation of this category, not as templates to copy, but as examples of what was possible. A new metric was added to the database. It was called tradition potential. Unlike other metrics, it did not measure current happiness. It measured capacity for meaning-making across generations. It asked not how happy a species was now, but how capable they were of building the kind of connections that would sustain happiness over centuries. The effect spread slowly across the galaxy. The collective stopped trying to copy human game night. Instead, they began developing their own tradition. Every 7 cycles, they gathered their young to teach them the old songs that had been nearly forgotten during the pursuit of perfect harmony. The songs were not perfect. Some of the words had been lost over time, but they sang them anyway because the singing itself had become the point. The mercurial swarm created something they called the remembering. Once per generation, the entire swarm gathered to share stories of those who had passed. The stories were not always accurate. Memory distorted details over time. But the swarm learned that accuracy was less important than connection. The stories bound them together across time. Even the silicon minds of Axiom 6, beings of pure logic, developed something unexpected. They called it the Archive of Errors. Once per cycle, they gathered to share stories of mistakes they had made. This had been unthinkable before. Errors were things to be corrected and forgotten, not celebrated. But the Silicon Mines discovered that sharing their failures created trust. Knowing that others had struggled and survived made their own struggles easier to bear. 9. The archivist who had first noticed the anomaly requested something unprecedented, the crystalline being asked for a leave of absence. In 11,000 cycles, no archivist had ever made such a request. They had given up physical form. They existed only to serve the database. What could possibly require them to leave? 9 wanted to visit Earth. The request went to the collective. There was much discussion. Archivists were not supposed to have personal interests. They were supposed to be beyond such things. But the database had just been restructured around new principles. Perhaps the archivists themselves needed to change as well. The request was granted. 9 traveled to Earth during the next holiday season. The archivist took a temporary physical form, something that had not been done in thousands of cycles. The body was awkward and strange, but it allowed 9 to experience what had previously only been recorded. The archivist arrived at the Anderson family home in Minnesota, the same family that had first observed years ago. Grandma and Grandpa were older now. Some faces at the table were new, some were missing, but the tradition continued. The storm came as it often did. The family came anyway. The food was too much. The casserole was still not optimized. Grandma stood up and told her story about the first Christmas in this house, now told for the 43rd time. 9 listened with the others. The archivist had the story in the database. Every word was recorded. Every pause was documented. But hearing it told in this room with these people was different. This is what we missed, 9 thought. For 11,000 cycles, we recorded happiness from the outside. We measured and analyzed and optimized. But we never sat at the table. We never heard the story told in the voice of the one who lived it. We never understood that the imperfection was not a flaw to be corrected. The imperfection was the point. After dinner, the family played cards. 9 did not know the rules. The archivist made many mistakes. The family laughed and helped and made gentle fun of this strange visitor who had come so far to play cards so badly. And 9 felt something that no archivist had felt in thousands of cycles. The archivist felt joy. It was not efficient. It was not optimized. It was messy and loud and confusing, but it was real in a way that data could never capture. When 9 returned to Prime, the archivist brought something new to the database. Not data, but understanding. Not a template, but wisdom. The archivist had learned what humans had somehow always known. Happiness was not a destination to be reached through optimization. It was a practice to be repeated through generations. It was grandmother's recipe made with imperfect hands. It was the same story told for the 43rd time. It was traveling through storms to sit in crowded rooms with people who sometimes annoyed you. It was choosing the difficult path, not because it was efficient, but because the difficulty itself gave the journey meaning. Across the galaxy, species continued the slow work of building their own traditions. Some would fail. Some would take generations to develop their significance. But they had learned the most important lesson the database had ever recorded. The imperfection was not a flaw to be corrected. The imperfection was a feature to be cherished. And somewhere on Earth, in a house that was slightly too small, a grandmother prepared her casserole for another year. The recipe was still not optimized. The gathering would still be too crowded. Someone would probably argue about politics. And it would be, as it always was, exactly perfect.